For 7 brutal months, the English fortress outside Orléans was considered untouchable. Stone fangs rising from the riverbank, bristling with archers who could split a man's skull before he even saw the bowstring snap. Yet in just 9 days, an untrained 16-year-old girl would do what France's greatest commanders had failed to attempt. But here's the twist. She didn't march in with overwhelming force. She arrived with nothing but a banner, a prophecy, and a conviction so fierce it bordered on impossible. Joan of Arc stepped onto the war-torn stage at a moment when France seemed seconds from collapse. Smoke hung in the air, food was gone, morale was a corpse, and yet she walked straight into the center of it, claiming she carried secrets that could flip the war on its head. Secrets no one believed, secrets that, if she was lying, would get her killed by her own side before she even reached the walls. And here's where everything changes, because once Joan touched the battlefield, events began unfolding at a speed that defied logic. English patrols hesitated. French veterans rallied. Rumors spread like wildfire that the impossible was suddenly within reach. But this was only the beginning. By early 1429, France wasn't merely losing the 100 Years' War, it was bleeding out. The English had carved deep into the heart of the kingdom, and the Burgundian alliance tightened around them like a vice. Orléans was the last major French stronghold on the Loire, the final barrier before England could slice France in half and crush the remaining resistance. But here's the twist. The English weren't rushing. They were confident, patient, and cruelly methodical. Their commander, the Earl of Salisbury, believed he held destiny in his gauntleted hands. His siege lines were precise, his artillery devastating, and his fortified bastions, like the infamous English Bastille at Les Tourelles, were engineered to withstand months of assault. His hubris was legendary. To him, France was already a conquered land, waiting for ink on a treaty. Yet the worst shock was still ahead. Across the river, the French situation was dire. Supplies dwindled, soldiers deserted in the night. Nobles argued endlessly, while common citizens starved beneath collapsing roofs. The Dauphin, future Charles VII, seemed paralyzed by fear, haunted by prophecies that his reign would end before it began. Even veteran captains whispered that Orléans might fall within weeks. And here's where everything changes. Into this suffocating gloom stepped a teenage peasant girl claiming divine guidance. Joan of Arc's arrival wasn't greeted with celebration. It was met with suspicion, political anxiety, and outright disbelief. Yet something in her voice, in her unshakable certainty, cut through the paralyzing fog of despair. Her presence carried a pressure the commanders couldn't explain, as if the air itself shifted. Still, the shadow of disaster loomed over every campfire and council chamber. And the true test had not yet begun. When Joan approached Orléans, the disparity between the two forces was nothing short of nightmarish. The English siege network wrapped around the city like iron thorns, an interlocking chain of bastilles, earthworks, firing positions, and fortified bridges that allowed them to dominate every crossing of the Loire. Their archers were the terror of Europe, veterans of Agincourt and Verneuil, men who could turn a charging line of knights into a forest of corpses in minutes. Their engineers had positioned cannons to choke every approach, and their patrols moved with a predator's precision. But here's the twist. They believed the French were too demoralized to mount any coordinated assault at all. Inside Orléans, the French army barely deserved the name. Commanders bickered, infantry units were depleted. Many soldiers fought with cracked armor and reused arrows scavenged from English corpses. The city's militia had heart, but not training, and certainly not the numbers to storm professional bastions. The French cavalry, once the pride of Europe, was reduced to a handful of nobles and mercenaries kept alive by sheer stubbornness. And yet, the worst shock was still ahead. Because Joan's true strength wasn't in numbers. It was in belief, a force the English couldn't measure on any battlefield map. Veterans who had been silent for months suddenly spoke with fire. Militiamen volunteered to fight at dawn. Even commanders who had dismissed her as a delusion felt a strange pull toward unity. And here's where everything changes. Her hidden advantage wasn't supernatural power. It was an instinctive grasp of morale warfare and timing. She understood something France had forgotten. Battles aren't won only through steel, but through momentum. And momentum can transform a starving militia into a force capable of reshaping history. Still, the tactical mismatch was brutal. The English held superior training, terrain, fortifications, and control of the river. The French held almost nothing, except a girl who refused to accept the limits of probability. What happened next defies logic, because Joan would force the French to strike at the exact point the English least expected, flipping the entire siege on its head. Yet the true impossibility was still ahead. Dawn on April 29th, 1429, broke under a sky the colour of hammered steel. Joan entered Orléans, not through a shattered gate or secret tunnel, but openly, on horseback, banner held high, riding straight past English archers who somehow did not shoot. Soldiers on both sides later swore the moment felt unreal, as if time stretched thin for a heartbeat. But here's the twist. Her arrival wasn't the victory, it was the spark. Shawanda 6. The shockwave. Begins within hours. The city stirred with a pulse it hadn't felt in months. Markets reopened. Women leaned from windows. Children followed her horse. The commanders, cautious and skeptical, found themselves dragged into her momentum. She demanded inspections of the city defenses, then walked them point by point, touching broken walls, tracing gaps, urging repairs. The sensory world of the siege pressed in, the reek of smoke, the metallic tang of old blood, the groan of distant English engines twisting ropes for their next artillery shot. But this was only the beginning. Hour 7 to 14, the first probe. Joan pushed for an assault on the English Bastille of Saint-Lô, a position the French believed too strong to challenge. The commanders hesitated. She insisted. Her argument wasn't tactical, it was timing. The English had shifted patrols to reinforce the southern bank, leaving Saint-Lô thin for just a few hours. And here's where everything changes. She sensed the window before anyone else even recognized it. When the French attacked, they didn't creep. They exploded from the city gates. The clash was deafening, iron on stone, the hiss of arrows slicing air, the thunder of feet over wooden bridges. Joan stood at the front, banner raised, a spear of white fabric cutting through smoke. Soldiers swore they moved faster simply because she was there. Within 2 hours, Saint-Lô fell, an unthinkable breach in the English chain. Yet the worst shock was still ahead. Hour 15:27. Counter-pressure. The English reeled. Their commanders scrambled to reinforce the remaining bastilles, sending urgent orders across the river. But Joan didn't allow the French to rest. She pressed forward, urging successive assaults that kept the English from rebuilding momentum. Her pacing was ruthless, almost surgical. Strike, breathe, strike again. Even veteran captains struggled to keep up. What happened next defies logic. Joan sensed morale fractures before they appeared on the field. She redirected troops not based on terrain alone, but on fear, aggression, hesitation, psychological currents invisible to every general except her. Soldiers followed because her certainty was louder than the enemy's cannons. Hour 28:40, Les Augustins falls. The next target was the English position at Les Augustins. The French assault was a blur of bodies and smoke, the fortress echoing with the crunch of collapsing wood and the screams of wounded men dragged from the breach. The air smelled of burning pitch. Joan was struck by a stone projectile and thrown to the ground. Dust and blood blurred her vision. But she rose, slowly, painfully, and lifted the banner again. And that single act broke the English line. The Bastille collapsed. The English withdrew in disarray. Still, the decisive moment had not yet arrived. Hour 41:54. The final paradox. The last and most fortified English stronghold, Les Tourelles, loomed over the Loire like a stone dragon. Holding the bridge, it was considered impregnable. English captains laughed openly at the French attempts to dislodge them. Joan didn't laugh. She prepared. The assault began under a hail of English arrows so thick they turned daylight into static. French ladders splintered against the walls. Men drowned in the river trying to cross. Commanders debated retreat. Morale sagged. But here's the twist. Wounded from the previous day, Joan walked onto the battlefield carrying her banner like a flame in the fog. French soldiers saw her, battered but unbroken, and surged forward with a roar that rolled across the river. The English, for the first time, hesitated. That hesitation was death. French troops pushed onto the bridge, overwhelmed the gate, and stormed the tower. Hours later, the English commander fell. Les Tourelles collapsed. The English line shattered, and with it, their 7-month siege disintegrated in less than 9 days. Yet the deeper revelation, Joan's true paradox, was about to emerge. When the smoke finally thinned over the Loire, the numbers didn't just tell a story, they screamed it. The English had lost well over a third of their forward garrison in just a few days of combat. Bastilles that were engineered to survive months collapsed in single afternoons. Longbow companies, once the apex predators of European battlefields, were reduced to scattered survivors fleeing across the river. But here's the twist. The French had expected to lose thousands in a failed breakout. Instead, they suffered a fraction of the predicted casualties. Inside Orléans, the aftermath unfolded like a fever dream. Streets filled with stunned soldiers clutching helmets dented by arrows that should have killed them. Priests rang bells until their hands blistered. Women wept openly, not just from relief, but from the shock of realizing they were no longer waiting to die. Yet the worst shock was still ahead, because the English collapse wasn't gradual, it was catastrophic. Their commanders reported shattered morale, broken formations, and a psychological rupture they couldn't explain. They had faced French knights before. They had faced desperate militias. But they had never faced an army animated by a single teenage girl who fought as if defeat were physically impossible. Amid the celebration, the wounds still bled. Joan herself was bandaged, bruised, and barely standing. Dozens of French families mourned sons who didn't return. Victory had come fast, but its cost still throbbed in the city's bones. And yet, even as Orléans healed, one question rose above the cheers like smoke. How could one impossible victory rewrite the fate of an entire kingdom?